The July 18, 2004 episode of the BBC series Top Gear demonstrated the 747's ability to blow automobiles across the runway, using only 2 of its 4 engines. During this segment, the show's host, Richard Hammond, had this to say.
Right, here we go. The pilot is easing up the throttle, building up the power. Now, it's crucial that we release the car at exactly the right time, because if these engines run at full thrust for more than 20 seconds, they'll start to rip up the runway.
And then we'll be in trouble!
So it seems, a Boeing 747's engine is powerful enough to blast a hole in the runway, even though the runway is designed to be hardened against such pressure. To explore this, we contacted Aussie Pilots Online to verify. Our email was answered by David Harakos. I think there would be a number of variables involved in answering the question about ripping up runways, like at what angle were the engines pointing, i.e. directly to the tarmac, parallel, etc. What is the tarmac depth, consistency? Regional and international tarmacs have different depths and strengths. What is the temperature on the day of the test? This will affect the tarmac stability. There's probably a heap more like this. When you hear something that sounds as incredible as this, it probably needs to be taken with a grain of salt. It would be disastrous if an aircraft was capable of spraying tarmac everywhere unless the circumstance was very unusual. So it might be possible, given the parameters and more above being loaded in favour of the result, but I don't think we'll see it anytime soon. Okay, so it's possible that the 747's engines would rip up the runway under the right circumstances. But what if these engines were tilted vertically over much softer terrain, like grass or dirt? We asked Harakos this, who stated, I would say that almost certainly that a loose surface like dirt and grass would be displaced by any significant and sustained thrust, provided the engines were angled towards the ground, but you're unlikely to find a 747 on a grass strip. It seems Harakos' statement was proven right, not by the Boeing 747, but by the Harrier, a vertically landing jet engine. Windley stated,
A Harrier jump jet thrusts at 37,000 pounds at takeoff, fully loaded, and it doesn't dig right down to bedrock. Casing simply falls into the layman's trap of assuming that rocket engines are always very powerful.
Ironically, little over a month after Windley posted this message, a member of the Bad Astronomy forum called Russ called him out on it.
The Harrier isn't such a good example. I was at the Oshkosh flying some years ago when they had a Harrier demo. They landed it on the grass because the jet blast would thermally crack the concrete runway. The grass landing was something you had to survive to believe. We were about 100 yards away and we were catching grass, dirt, pebbles, worms, paper, trash, you name it. It left a burnt crater about 1 Harrier in diameter and about a foot deep.
In his own response, Windley admitted that a runway is supposed to be hardy against jet blast. Yet to this day, he makes no mention of this on his website and continues to insist that the engines on Harriers and jumbo jets can't leave blast craters. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the engines on a Boeing 747 and the Harrier are indeed capable of blasting holes in the ground. But compared to the Lunar module, these engines produce considerably more thrust. Further, according to the propagandists, the descent engine's pressure had to be throttled down from 10,000 pounds of thrust to 3,000 or 2,500 pounds of thrust in order to land. As Phil Plait states on his website,
When someone driving a car pulls into a parking spot, do they do it at 100 km per hour? Of course not. They slow down first, easing off the accelerator. The astronauts did the same thing. Sure, the rocket on the lander was capable of 10,000 pounds of thrust, but they had a throttle. They fired the rocket hard to deorbit, and slow enough to land on the moon. But they didn't need to thrust that hard as they approached the lunar surface. They throttled down to about 3,000 pounds of thrust.
Needless to say, the propagandists all claim that 3,000 pounds of thrust isn't enough to burn a crater in the ground. But is this really true? Armadillo Aerospace is a private Texas-based organization that builds experimental rockets and aims to achieve orbital spaceflight for tourists. In 2008, Armadillo Aerospace won a whopping $350,000 for completing Level 1 of Grumman's Lunar Lander Challenge. Their prize-winning rocket was known as the Pixel, an experimental computer-controlled lander. On May 14, 2007, Armadillo Aerospace successfully performed a 3-minute hover test. It is important to note that the Pixel used a 3,000-pound thrust engine, the same amount of thrust that the LEM used in order to land on the moon. Here is the video the company released. As you can see, the Pixel's 3,000-pound thrust engine was able to dig a noticeable crater in the tarmac. As New Scientist Space reported that day, heated concrete appears to pop off the launch pad at times. In searching Armadillo's site for more videos of the Pixel, I had the good fortune to come across this video of a rocket test. Watch as the rocket clearly blasts a hole through the concrete. I contacted Armadillo's technical staff with links to this video in question to ask exactly how much thrust the engine produced. My message was answered by the founder and lead engineer at Armadillo Aerospace, John D. Carmack. These are his exact words. That was our first LOX and alcohol-powered vehicle, and it only made about 500 pounds of thrust. Our more recent vehicles make about 3,000 pounds of thrust. So, by Carmack's admission, a rocket engine burning a measly 500 pounds of thrust is enough to dig a hole through concrete. So if a mere 500 pounds of thrust will do that to concrete, what do you suppose 3,000 pounds of thrust will do on much looser terrain like lunar regolith? You would think that a former NASA contractor who worked on the Hubble, not to mention a former aerospace engineer who worked for Boeing, Airbus and Grumman, would surely have known that even engines running at 500 pounds of thrust could leave craters in the ground. So why would they have you believe that engines running at 5 times that thrust is unable to do likewise? Quite clearly, there should indeed have been a blast crater under the LEM. As usual, the propagandists have been distorting the facts about this. And their distortion of the facts continues to this day. Phil Plait claims that in the vacuum of space, the LEM's engine plume spread out and reduced the pressure to 1.5 psi.
Now here comes a little bit of math. The engine nozzle was about 54 inches across, which means it had an area of 2,300 square inches. That, in turn, means that the thrust generated a pressure of only about 1.5 pounds per square inch. That's not a lot of pressure.
Dr. Wernher von Braun disagreed. In the early 1950s, Dr. von Braun proposed a 50-crew expedition to the moon. Each rocket ship would descend to the moon using a cluster of 30 engines, all capable of delivering 13.56 tons of thrust, for a total of 407 tons of thrust. At face value, this may sound like a hell of a lot more thrust than what the lunar module descent engine produced. However, Wernher von Braun assures us that in the vacuum of space, the pressure of the exhaust gases would be reduced from 214 psi to 0.14 psi. As he writes on page 26 of his 1953 book, Conquest of the Moon,